A frozen hand scraped at pine planks. Snow drifted in around her bare ankles. The sound came before the dawn did, a slow, dragging rasp against the bottom of the door, like something half-dead trying to remember how to knock. He set down his coffee. He listened. A second scrape, then a soft, broken sound that was almost a word. He lifted the bar. The wind shoved the door open before he could. A woman lay curled on his threshold, blue-lipped, her coat stiff with ice, one frostbitten hand still reaching for the latch. Blood was frozen black at her temple. She did not speak. She only looked up at him, with eyes the color of river ice, and pressed something into his glove. An oilskin packet, no bigger than a prayer book. 18 winters, he had lived alone on this mountain. Stay with me on this one. He dragged her in by the shoulders of that frozen coat. She weighed almost nothing, the way a starved deer weighs almost nothing, all bone and angle under wet wool. He kicked the door shut against the wind and threw the bar back across it, and the cabin went still in that strange, shocked way a room goes still after a gunshot. The fire popped once in the iron stove. The kettle hissed. Outside, the pines kept whispering the same low warning they had been whispering all night, and he ignored them, the way a man learns to ignore the woods when there is finally something inside the cabin that needs him more than the woods do. He laid her on the bare hide in front of the stove. He did not undress her, not yet, not all the way. He had been a younger man once, with a younger man's hurry, and he had learned the hard way that you do not warm a frozen body too fast. You will kill what the cold did not. So he worked slow. He pulled off her boots, and the leather was so stiff he had to cut the laces with his skinning knife. Her stockings underneath were soaked black. Her toes were white as candle wax, and two of them, the small ones, had gone the color of old bruise, and he knew, looking at them, that she was going to lose those toes whether she lived or not. He covered her feet in a wool blanket and set a stone, warm from the hearth, beside them, wrapped in flannel, not touching. Her face was young. That was the part that struck him first, after the immediate animal panic of keeping her alive had passed. She was young. Not a girl, not anymore, but young the way his own wife had been young, 24 maybe, 25 at the outside. Her hair, where it was not frozen to her cheek, was the color of wet wheat. A wedding band cut into the swollen flesh of her ring finger, and the swelling told him the ring had been on a long time, and the freshness of the cut told him the cold had only just started taking the finger. There was a wound at her temple, an old one, 3 days at least, scabbed and weeping and frozen over again. Someone had hit her. Not the mountain. The mountain does not strike at a temple. Men do. He had not seen another human face since the first snow, and the first snow had come early this year, in the second week of October, and now it was the dead heart of January. Almost 3 months of his own breath, his own footsteps, his own thoughts going round and round inside the 4 log walls. He was a trapper. He had been a trapper for 27 years. Before that he had been other things, a surveyor, a soldier, a husband, but those men felt like strangers to him now, like people he had once read about in a book whose cover he had forgotten. The man he was now ran a trapline of 47 sets across the north face of the ridge, and he knew every blowdown and every creek bend, and every place the marten liked to den, and that was, he had told himself, enough for any man. The woman on his bare hide began to shiver. That was good. The shivering meant her body still believed it was worth fighting for. He had pulled bodies out of drifts that had stopped shivering, and those bodies had not come back, no matter what he did with the stove and the blankets and the broth. He set water to boil. He sliced thin strips of dried venison into the pot and crushed in a half-handful of dried juniper berries and a pinch of salt, and the steam started to climb, and the small mean cabin began to smell like a place where a person might still want to live. He looked at her again. He still did not know her name. He did not yet know whose daughter she was. He did not yet know what was sewn into the lining of the coat he was about to peel off her. The coat. He came back to the coat. It was a man's coat, far too big for her, the shoulders hanging halfway to her elbows, the hem stiff and dark with what he was almost certain was dried blood, not all of it hers. The wool was old, the cut older still, with bone buttons of a fashion he had not seen on a living man in 20 years. He had seen a coat like that exactly once before, and he did not want to think about where. He pushed the thought down the way. A man pushes a dog off a chair. Not now. There was a living thing on his floor, and he was a trapper, not a ghost, and the living thing came first. He cut the buttons off with 2 clean strokes of the skinning knife and worked the sleeves down her arms. That was when she opened her eyes. The lids cracked slow, as if she had to remember which muscles to use. The eyes underneath were that river ice color he had first seen on the threshold. Only now, in the firelight, he could see a darker ring around the iris, the color of bark after rain. She looked at him. She did not look afraid. That was the strangest thing. A woman alone on a mountain with a strange man twice her age, half undressed in his cabin, and she did not look afraid. She looked instead like a person who had run out of fear 3 days ago and had been running on something colder ever since. Her cracked lips moved. He bent close. She said one word, and the word was please. Then her eyes closed again, and her head rolled back against the bare hide, and he sat there for a long moment with her sleeve in his fist, listening to the kettle, listening to himself breathe, listening to a silence in his chest that had been there for 18 winters and was, very faintly, starting to crack. He hung the coat on the drying rack by the stove. He spread it wide so the heat could get at the seams. Steam began to rise off the wool in pale ribbons. He turned back to the woman. He worked the wedding band off her finger slow, with a smear of bacon grease to ease it, because the swelling would only get worse before it got better, and a ring left on a swelling finger is how a person loses a hand. The ring came free. He set it on the shelf beside the lamp. It was a plain band, hand-cut, with 2 letters scratched on the inside, a J and an R, and a date he did not let himself read yet, because there was a buzzing starting at the back of his skull, and he did not want to know, not yet, why that buzzing was there. He fed her broth on the tip of a horn spoon, 3 drops at a time, the way you feed a half-drowned lamb. Some of it she swallowed. Most of it ran down her chin and into the wool. He did not mind. He talked to her low, in the voice he used on his sled dog when the dog was hurt, a voice he had not used on another human being in so long he was surprised it still worked. He told her she was all right. He told her she was safe now. He told her the stove was hot and the door was barred, and there was a Henry rifle above the lintel that he kept oiled and loaded, and that whatever was out there in the dark was going to have to come through him to get to her. He did not know when he said it that he was making a promise. But the woods knew. The woods always know first. The wind picked up around mid-morning. He heard it before he saw the new snow start, a long, low note in the chimney, the kind of note that meant the storm was not done with the country yet, the kind of note that meant whoever was tracking her, if anyone was tracking her, was about to lose her tracks for good. He almost smiled at that. He had not smiled in a long time, and the muscle of it felt unfamiliar, like a tool he had not picked up in years. He banked the fire. He pulled a chair to the bare hide and sat down beside her, the Henry across his knees, and he watched her chest rise and fall, slow and shallow but steady. And for the first time since the first snow, he felt something other than the long, flat patience of a man waiting out a season alone. He did not sleep. He sat. He listened to the storm thicken and the cabin breathe and the woman breathe, and somewhere around noon, when the light through the oilcloth window had gone the color of pewter, she stirred again, and this time she got a whole sentence out before the cold and the laudanum of exhaustion took her back. She said, "He is still coming." Then she said, "I am sorry I brought him here." He set his hand very lightly on her wrist. Her pulse was there. It was small, but it was there, and it was beating in the rhythm of a person who has decided, somewhere deep, to live. He told her in that low dog voice that she had not brought anyone anywhere. He told her this mountain was his, and on his mountain the only thing that came uninvited and stayed was the snow. Then he stood. He crossed to the drying rack. He laid his palm flat against the wool of the coat to see how dry it had gotten, and when his palm came down across the left breast, just above where a heart would be, he felt it. a square of something stiffer than wool, a shape sewn between the wool and the lining. He froze. He stood there for a long count of 10 with his hand pressed to a dead man's coat on a young woman's behalf, and he listened to the buzzing at the back of his skull get louder. And he knew, the way an old trapper knows there is a wolverine in the set before he gets to the set, that whatever was sewn into that coat was going to change the shape of the rest of his life. He took the coat down. He laid it across the table. He picked up his skinning knife. The blade was thin from 1,000 wettings, and it slid through the old stitches as easily as it slid through summer hide. He worked the lining open along 3 inches of seam. He reached 2 fingers in. He drew out an oilskin packet, folded twice, tied with a strip of black ribbon that had gone gray with age. He set it on the table. He stared at it. The wind hit the chimney again. The woman on the bare hide whimpered once in her sleep. He untied the ribbon. He unfolded the oilskin. Inside were 2 things, and only 2. A daguerreotype in a small brass case, the velvet inside worn smooth. And a letter, folded into quarters, the paper foxed at the edges, the ink the rusty brown that ink goes when it has waited a long time to be read. He opened the case first. The hinge made a tiny sound, like a finger bone cracking. The image inside was of a man, seated, a younger man, maybe 30, in a high collar and a dark frock coat, with a thin, neat mustache and pale eyes that, even in the silver of the plate, looked like river ice. The face was familiar, the way a half-remembered him is familiar. He sat down. He did not remember sitting down. The chair was simply suddenly under him. He held the case closer to the lamp. He looked at the mouth, the set of the jaw, the small notch in the left eyebrow where a scar would later be, and the buzzing in his skull went very quiet, and the cabin went very quiet, and even the storm outside seemed to lean in a little to listen. He knew this face. He had buried this face. He had buried it himself, 18 winters ago, in the ground behind a chapel 40 miles south of where he sat. He had paid for the marker. He had carved the dates into the pine himself, before the iron one came up from the foundry, because the ground was hard and the family had nobody else, and the priest had said somebody had to. He had stood in the rain at that grave for a long time, and then he had walked away into the trapping country, and he had not come back down the mountain in any meaningful way since. The man in the daguerreotype was the man in that grave, and the woman shivering on his bare hide was wearing that dead man's coat. His hands had begun to shake. He set the case down. He picked up the letter. He told himself as he unfolded it that he was being foolish, that there were 100 coats like this one in the territory, that pale eyes were not uncommon, that grief, even old grief, played tricks on a man who had been alone too long. He told himself this all the way through the unfolding. Then his eye fell on the first line of the letter, and the line was, "My dearest daughter." And the second line was a name. And the name was a name he had not spoken aloud in 18 winters, because the man it had belonged to had owed him a debt no grave could close, and he had decided, that day in the rain, that the debt would die where the man had died, and he would carry the rest of it alone. He read the letter. He read it twice. The handwriting was the same handwriting he had seen on a bank draft a long time ago, the same hooked R, the same narrow E. The letter was dated the spring before the man's death, written in case, the writer said, in case something should happen. It spoke of a child, a girl just 3 years old then, being sent east to a sister in St. Louis. It spoke of a wrong the writer had done to another man, a friend, a partner, a man whose wife had died because of that wrong, and it asked in plain words that if anything ever happened, the child should be told the truth. The truth was this. The writer had let another man's wife die. He had not killed her. He had, the letter said, simply failed to act in time, had hesitated, had chosen the safer trail, and a fever and a long ride and a closed pass had done the rest. The friend, the partner, had never known. The writer had not had the courage to tell him, not before he died, and so he was telling now the only person he could still tell, his daughter, in a letter she might never read, sewn into a coat she might never wear. The trapper set the letter down on the table. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, until he saw colors. His wife's name, on the page in that hooked R hand, was a sound he had not let himself hear inside his own head for 18 years. The man who had written the letter was the man who had hesitated on the trail. The man who had hesitated on the trail was the partner he had buried with his own hands. And the woman on the bare hide, the woman whose toes he had wrapped in flannel, the woman whose wedding band sat now on his shelf next to his lamp, was that man's 3-year-old daughter grown. She had come to him out of the storm. She had brought her father's coat back to the only person left alive who would know what was sewn inside it. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. He sat with that knowledge for a long time. The fire burned down. He did not feed it. He listened to her breathing. He listened to the wind. He listened mostly to a young version of himself riding hard up a pass that had been closed for 2 days, knowing already, in the way a man knows, that he was riding to a grave and not to a sickbed. He had blamed the weather after. He had blamed the doctor in the lower town who had been drunk that morning. He had blamed God briefly, and then he had stopped blaming God because God did not seem to be listening. He had never, in 18 winters, blamed his partner. His partner had ridden out the day before, ahead of him, with the medicine, with the strong horse, with the better chance. His partner had come back 2 days later, saying the pass was closed, and the trapper had believed him, because his partner had been the kind of man you believed. And his wife by then had been 3 days dead. He looked at the woman on the bare hide. He tried to be angry. He tried to summon the long buried thing in his chest, the rage he had folded up and put away the day he buried his partner alongside the memory of his wife, neat, in the same plot of frozen ground. The rage did not come. What came instead was a strange, tired thing, almost like pity, almost like recognition. The man who had hesitated on that trail had been a coward, yes. But he had also been a young man with a young wife and a 3-year-old daughter, and he had spent the rest of his short life carrying a secret that had eaten him from the inside until a fever took what was left. The trapper knew, the way a trapper knows whether, that his partner had not died of fever. His partner had died of the letter that was now lying on his table. He looked at her again. Her cheek had a little color in it now. The shivering had eased. Her breath came deeper. She was, against all odds and all weather, going to live. And living, she was going to wake. And waking, she was going to need to know where she was, and who he was, and why her father had sewn a confession into the lining of a coat she had then, somehow, ended up wearing across a freezing mountain at the wrong end of January with a wound at her temple and another man's blood on her hem. He did not yet know that part. The letter did not say. The letter had been written when she was 3. 21 years of her life were not in the oilskin. 21 years of her life were going to come out of her own mouth, in this cabin in front of this stove, and he was going to have to listen to all of them, because the debt that had been opened that morning 18 winters ago, the debt he had carried alone, the debt he had thought died with his partner, had just walked in out of the snow and laid itself down on his bare hide and asked him, with one cracked word, please. He thought about the trail he had ridden the day his wife died. He thought about the snowmelt running gray under his horse, the gunmetal sky, the way the spruce had bent low over the path like old men listening. He had pushed the horse hard. He had pushed it harder than he had ever pushed a horse, before or since. He had come down out of the pass at last light and found his partner sitting at the table in the lower town, dry, warm, with a half-drunk cup of coffee in his hand and the medicine still in its oilskin in the saddlebag by the door. His partner had looked up at him and said the pass was closed. He had not said it with his mouth quite straight. The trapper had seen it then, the small wrong shape of the lie, and he had chosen, for reasons he could not name, not to look at it. He had taken the medicine and ridden back up alone in the dark, and the dark and the medicine had both arrived 3 hours too late. He got up. He moved like an older man than he had been an hour before. He fed the fire. He banked it careful so it would last till dark. He hung the coat back on the rack, the lining slid open, the oilskin packet folded neat on the table beside the letter and the case and the wedding band, 4 small objects in a row, the whole shape of his next 20 years arranged in a line on the pine boards. He set the Henry rifle within reach of the chair. Then he sat down beside her again, the way a father might sit beside a sick child, the way a husband might sit beside a wife who had pulled through, the way a man sits when he has finally been given, after a long winter of silence, a thing to do. She woke at dusk. The cabin was warm. The storm had thickened into a steady howl. She came back into her body slow, by inches, the way feeling comes back into a frozen foot, painful and surprising. He had moved her by then, off the bare hide and onto his own narrow rope bed, which he had not slept in for so long it had begun to feel like furniture rather than a bed. He had built up the fire. He had set fresh broth at her elbow, and a tin cup of water with a little honey stirred in. He had not, the whole long afternoon, opened his mouth to speak. He had been rehearsing. He had been deciding, again and again, what a man owed another man's daughter, when that other man had owed him everything. She opened her eyes. She did not startle this time. She looked at the rough ceiling beams and at the lamp and at the iron stove, and then she looked at him, sitting in the chair beside her, and a small, careful something moved behind her face. She said her name first. Her name was Hannah. She said she was the wife of a man named John, and her husband had been a homesteader, and her husband had been killed 8 days ago by a man who had ridden up out of the pass at sundown with a story about a bad debt and a worse temper. She said the man had taken what he came for and had left her for dead in the snow. She said she had crawled back into the house and found her husband already gone, and she had taken what she could carry, and she had walked. She had not at first known where she was walking. She had only known that the man who had killed her husband had said, before he left, that he would come back in the spring to make sure of her, because dead women, he had said, were better neighbors than living ones. She had walked 4 nights and 3 days, sleeping under blowstones, eating snow, until she had seen the smoke from his chimney, very small against the gray dawn. She had not chosen his cabin. She had crawled toward the only smoke on the mountain. She did not know whose smoke it was. She paused there. She looked at him a long moment. She said, "My father used to speak of this country. He said there was a man up here who had been his partner once." She said, "I think my father gave you this coat to give back to me." The trapper did not answer at once. He let the words sit between them. He looked at her face, at the cheekbones that were her father's cheekbones, at the eyes that were her mother's. He could see that now, river ice and bark after rain, and he thought of the small grave 40 miles south and the smaller grave beside his own cabin, the one with no marker because his wife had asked, before the end, that she be left to the trees. He thought of the letter on the table. He thought of the man, somewhere in the storm, who had said he would come back in the spring. Spring, he thought, was a long way off, but not as long as a man might wish. He said very quietly, "Your father did not give me this coat. Your father gave me a promise. The coat just came along after." He told her then. Not all of it, not at once, but the shape of it. He told her about her father and her mother, and a young woman named Sarah who had been his wife. He told her about a closed pass in a wet spring and a fever and a hesitation. He told her about the burial and the marker and the 18 winters. He did not call her father a coward. He did not call him a friend either. He called him simply, "the man I rode with." He watched her face while he talked. She did not weep. She had, he understood, used up her weeping somewhere out on the 4-night walk. She only listened with those river ice eyes, and when he had finished she nodded once, slow, like a person who had suspected for a long time and was only now being told, and she said, "Then I have come to the right cabin." They sat with that. The fire crackled. The wind worried at the door. Somewhere far down the ridge a wolf called, and another answered, and the trapper found that he was no longer counting his winters. He was counting, instead, the rounds in the Henry, the cords of wood in the lean-to, the days till the high passes would melt enough for a man on a strong horse to ride up out of the lower country. He was counting the things a man counts when he has decided, without quite saying so, that someone else's spring is going to be his fight. He looked at Hannah. He told her she would stay until she was healed. He told her that when the man came in the spring, if the man came, he would not find a dead woman in the snow. He would find a trapper at the door, with a debt to settle and a Henry that did not miss. She closed her eyes. She did not say thank you. He was glad of that. Thank you was too small a word for the thing that had passed between them in the lamplight, the thing 18 winters in the making, the thing a father had sewn into a coat in the hope that one day the right hands would open it. The trapper rose and crossed to the table. He picked up the 4 small objects, the case, the letter, the ring, the ribbon. He carried them to the shelf above the bed. He set them in a row where she could see them when she woke. Then he banked the fire one more time, and he sat down in his chair, and he watched the door, and he waited, the way he had waited 18 winters for the debt to come due. Only this time he was not waiting alone, and this time, for the first time in a long time, the waiting felt like the beginning of something instead of the end. He waited. If you are still with me on this one, hit that subscribe button. There are stories out here that nobody else is telling. There are people who walked out of the bush alone, and people who walked into it never to come back. I am telling you about Eli Brandt and a woman whose name I am about to give you. Stay where you are. She woke once more before full dark. She was clearer now. The cold had let go of her enough that her face had a little color. She looked at the baby against her hip. She put her hand on its back. She closed her eyes for a second, and her mouth moved like a prayer with no sound. Then she looked at Eli. "My name is Hannah," she said. "Hannah Whitcomb." He nodded. He had thought as much. "The baby is Ruth," she said. "She is 6 months. She is a quiet baby. She does not cry much. That is why we are still alive. He hunted us by sound for 2 nights. Eli waited. "My husband is dead," she said. "Joseph?" 2 weeks. There was a prospector who came up the river in November. He said he had a stake on our quarter section. He said the papers were in town. Joseph said the papers were not. They argued at the door. The man went away. He came back at night with kerosene. He set the cabin. Joseph went out the front. He had the rifle. The man shot him in the chest from behind the woodpile. I went out the back with the baby. I had my coat. That is all I had. I walked. I do not remember most of it. I saw smoke this morning." She stopped. She breathed. She started again. "He has been behind me the whole way. I heard him last night. He has a dog. A big yellow dog. He talks to the dog. He talks to it like it is a person. He is sick in the head. He is not afraid of anything. He has my husband's rifle. He has his own rifle. He has a hatchet on his belt. He has matches. He has whatever was in the smokehouse. He is wearing my husband's good red coat. He is wearing it." Her voice cracked on the last word. She closed her eyes. She did not cry. Her tears were used up. Eli reached over. He laid his big rough hand on her hair, the way a man lays a hand on a child's head. He kept it there for a second. Then he picked up the rifle and went to the window. The first sound came an hour after full dark. A dog. Not one of his. His dogs had not made a sound. They were trained that way. The other dog was farther out. 1/2 mile maybe. The bark was deep and slow. The bark of a heavy animal walking at a steady pace. The bark of an animal that had been told to be quiet and had forgotten. Eli watched the line of black spruce on the far bank. The moon came up. It was a thin moon, but the snow threw the light back. He could see the river ice as a long gray road. He waited. The dog barked again. Closer. Then a man's voice. Low. Saying something to the dog. A laugh. Short and dry. A shape stepped out of the spruce. A man. Tall. He was wearing a red coat. The coat was too small for him in the shoulders. He carried a rifle in his right hand. He had a second rifle slung across his back. He had a hatchet on his hip. The dog walked at his heel. The dog was the size of a small calf. The man stopped at the edge of the ice. He looked up at the cabin. The lamp inside threw a square of warm light onto the snow. The man could see the light. He could not see Eli at the window. Eli was in the dark behind the lamp. The man cupped his hands and shouted. The voice came clear across the ice. "You have something of mine in there, friend. Send her out. Send the baby out too. There is no quarrel with you. There is a quarrel with her. Send them out, and I am gone by sunup." Eli did not answer. He laid the rifle barrel across the window ledge. He sighted along the iron. The man was 400 yards out. Too far for a clean shot in this light. The man knew it too. That was why he was standing in the open. "Friend," the man called again. "I will count to 100. Then I am coming up. I have killed 2 men this winter. I have no taste for a third. But I will. Send her out." Eli set the rifle down quietly. He turned. Hannah was sitting up on the bunk now. She had the baby against her chest. Her face was white, but her jaw was set hard. "There is a root cellar," Eli said. "Under the floor. Trapdoor under the bunk. There is a candle and a wool blanket and a tin of biscuits. You take the baby. You go down. You shut the trap. You do not come up until I open it. If I do not open it by morning, you wait until the cabin goes cold. Then you take the baby and you go south along the river. You walk on the ice. South. The next smoke is the Heaney place. 19 miles. You ask for Margaret Heaney. She will know what to do." Hannah looked at him. "You cannot fight him alone." "I am not going to fight him alone," Eli said. "I am going to fight him on my ground. There is a difference." She nodded once. He helped her off the bunk. He lifted the bare hide. He pulled the rag rug aside. There was a square trapdoor cut in the plank floor. He lifted it. There was a small space below. He handed her down. He passed the baby down to her. He passed the candle. He passed the biscuits. He shut the trap. He covered it with the rug. He pushed the bunk back over it. Then he stood alone in his cabin. He looked around once. At the stove. At the iron pot. At the row of cartridges on the table. At the door. He picked up the rifle. He put out the lamp. When the lamp went out, the cabin went into full dark. Outside, the man across the ice would see the light vanish. He would not know why. He would think for a half-second that they had run out the back. He would start to move. Eli moved too. He went to the back wall. He pulled out a loose plank. There was a second door behind it. A door no man on the river knew about except him. It opened into a low passage under the snowbank. He had dug it the second winter. A bolt hole. A man alone in the bush needs a bolt hole. He had never used it. He used it now. He went out into the cold and the dark behind the cabin. He came up beside the dog yard. He whispered to the lead dog. The lead dog rose without a sound. He unhooked the chain. He pointed across the ice. "Out," he said. "Out, boy." The lead dog went. The whole team went after him. 8 dogs across the river ice at a dead run. Silent. The way he had trained them. They were not running at the man. They were running past him. But the yellow dog did not know that. The yellow dog turned, and the yellow dog barked, and the yellow dog charged. The man across the ice swung his rifle. He fired once. He missed. He fired again. The lead dog went down. The other dogs did not stop. They ran around him. They ran past him. They ran for the spruce on the far bank. The yellow dog ran after them, barking and slobbering and forgetting everything it had been told. The man was alone on the ice now. His dog was gone. His back was to the cabin. He was 300 yards out. Eli came up the bank to the corner of the cabin. He braced the rifle against the log. He took his time. He breathed out slow. He squeezed. The shot was one shot. The man on the ice folded. The red coat made a bright spot in the moonlight. The hatchet rolled away. The rifle slid out of his hand. He did not get up. Eli waited. He waited a full 10 minutes. The man did not move. The yellow dog did not come back. The wind moved across the ice and pushed a little dust of snow across the red coat. That was all. Eli walked down. He walked slow. He kept the rifle up. When he got to the man, he kicked the rifle away first. He kicked the hatchet away second. He knelt down. The man was dead. The shot had gone clean. There was no need for a second one. Eli was glad of that. He had not wanted to. He searched the coat. Joseph Whitcomb's coat. He found a folded paper in the inside pocket. He found a small daguerreotype of Hannah and Joseph standing in front of their cabin in summer. He found a man's wedding band tied to a leather cord around the dead man's neck. Joseph's ring, cut from the finger after the fire. Eli put the picture and the ring in his own pocket. He left the paper where it was. He would give it to the Mountie at Fort McKay in the spring. He pulled the dead man back from the river edge by the boots. He laid him on his back in the snow. He folded the dead hands across the dead chest. It was more than the man deserved. But Eli was not the kind of man who left a body in any other shape. Not even that body. He walked back across the ice. The lead dog was lying where it had fallen. It was still breathing. He carried it back up to the cabin. He carried it inside. He laid it by the stove. The bullet had gone through the shoulder. It had missed the heart. He boiled water. He cleaned the wound. He stitched it with sail thread. The dog watched him the whole time without a sound. The way it had been trained. He went to the bunk. He pulled the rug back. He lifted the trapdoor. Hannah was sitting on the wool blanket with the candle on the floor in front of her and the baby asleep in her arms. She looked up at him. She did not have to ask. "Done," he said. "Come up." She came up. She held the baby. She walked over to the dog by the stove. She knelt down. She put her hand on the dog's head. The dog licked her wrist once and closed its eyes. Hannah began to cry then. Quiet. Not loud. The kind of crying that comes after a person has stopped being afraid and remembered they were a person. Eli sat down in the chair by the stove. He looked at the woman and the baby and the dog. He thought about his own wife. He thought about his own daughter. He had been carrying them for 10 years like a stone in his coat pocket. He could feel the stone shift. He could feel it settle into a new place. In the spring, Eli hitched the surviving dogs to the sled. He loaded Hannah and Ruth and the daguerreotype and Joseph's wedding ring and 3 weeks of supplies. He took them south. He took them to the Heaney place. Margaret Heaney took Hannah inside. She fed her stew. She held the baby. She wrote a letter to Hannah's sister in St. Paul, Alberta. The letter went out on the next freight wagon. 2 months later, the sister came up by train and stage. She took Hannah and Ruth back south with her. Hannah came back. 3 years later. She came back in summer. She came up the river road in a wagon with a hired man driving. She had Ruth with her. Ruth was 3. Ruth had her father's eyes in her mother's mouth. Hannah was wearing a plain gray dress. She was not wearing a wedding band. She was wearing Joseph's ring on a chain around her neck. She did not knock on the cabin door. She came around the side. She found Eli splitting wood by the shed. He set the axe down. He looked at her. She looked at him. Ruth stood between them with one small hand on her mother's skirt and stared up at the big bearded man like she had been told about him her whole short life. Because she had. "I came back," Hannah said. "I see that," Eli said. "I'm not asking for anything," she said. I am telling you. I came back. Eli looked down at Ruth. He went down on one knee in front of her. He held out his big, rough hand. Ruth looked at her mother. Hannah nodded. Ruth put her small hand in his. They were married in the fall. Not in a church. A circuit preacher came up the river on his rounds and stood with them in the dog yard while the leaves were turning. Margaret Heaney came up with her husband to witness. The lead dog was there too. He had a scar on his shoulder where the bullet had gone through. He sat at Eli's feet like he had been doing it all his life. Eli lived another 26 years. He raised Ruth as his own. He had 2 more children with Hannah. A boy named Joseph after the first husband. A girl named for his first wife. He never spoke about the night on the ice except once. He told the boy when the boy was old enough. He said only this. He said a man does not always get a second chance in this life. He said most men get none. He said if a second chance comes crawling through your door at dawn with somebody small inside its coat, you do not stand there with the door cracked 1 inch. You open the door. You open it all the way. And you let them in. He died in his own bed in the cabin he had built. Hannah was beside him. Ruth was beside her. The lead dog had been gone 20 years by then, but a son of that dog was lying on the floor at the foot of the bed. The fire was going. The wind was moving across the roof the way it always did. Eli closed his eyes once. He opened them once more. He looked at Hannah. He said her name. He said it the way a man says a word he has been waiting to say his whole life. Then he was gone. Out the door. Across the ice. Toward whatever smoke was waiting for him on the far bank.